Welcome to the Teens Talk podcast, created by the Student Virtual Board of Youth Celebrate Diversity. YCD supports teachers and students organizing locally, educating themselves and their peers, and taking action for inclusion and social justice. For more information, please visit ycdiversity.org. Thanks for tuning into this episode. Today, I'm going to be speaking with Erin Studer, the director of CHIME Institute's charter schools in California. We will be discussing his empowering journey as an advocate for people with disabilities and diverse needs in education.
My name's Erin Studer. I'm the executive director at CHIME Institute in Los Angeles, California. And CHIME is actually an acronym. It stands for Community Honoring Inclusive Model Education. And I have been an educator in LA since 1998. I was a special education teacher for many years for middle school and high school students. I was also a general education teacher for many years. I did that. And my opportunity here to work at CHIME has sort of combined both of those worlds, I guess. And maybe they were always supposed to be one world. But CHIME runs fully inclusive education programs for children birth to age 14 here in LA. And probably our largest program that I spend the most time at is a TK, transitional kindergarten through 8th grade public school here in LA.
Yeah, thank you. You did a great introduction. A lot of moving parts, but kind of going into this conversation though, about disability and inclusivity. In most schools, at least from where I went to high school and stuff there, students with disabilities are usually supported by like a special education department or classroom. What are your thoughts on special education? Why did you kind of decide to have a more of an inclusive model?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, what I would say is to understand inclusion and why we do it, we have to understand a couple things. And one is history and one is research, right? And so really the history of special education is not that long. We particularly as a element of schools and how we run schools, for many, many, many years in our country, individuals with disabilities were not educated in public schools. And in fact, there's a lot of history of case law, right? Cases tried in our public court system that allowed for the exclusion of individuals with disabilities in our schools and frankly in our societies as well. Not until 1975 when we passed a federal law called the Education for All Handicapped Children's Act, which later was renamed to IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, did it require that all public schools offer what we call a free and appropriate public education to children with disabilities. But what happened when schools started to implement that? On the one hand, many schools continued to fight it, even though it was law. They still were trying to find, ways maybe to not fulfill the spirit of the law and give free and appropriate education to people with disabilities or children with disabilities. The other thing is that they designed really totally separate programs. They ran parallel schools within schools to serve those kids, right? So we did that for several decades, actually, and that's where we get to the research, which shows us that kids who are educated in segregated settings often don't make the gains that we'd like them to. They don't make up the gap with their typically developing peers. And in fact, the gap between their knowledge and skills widens between themselves and typically developing peers the longer they are educated in segregated settings, right? These special education, special day classes, special schools, resource rooms, etc. What research shows as well is that when you have a high quality inclusive program, those students actually do much, much better they start to close the gap between their skills and knowledge of themselves and their typically developing peers. And we see all kinds of social and emotional benefits for everybody, for all the students, including typically developing students. So that's at CHIME, that's where we come from, right? That's why we want to create these model demonstration sites of inclusive education, because we are pushing back on that history of uh, exclusion and exclusionary practices and segregating practices. And we are honoring what research tells us is good practice, which is high quality inclusive education.
Yeah, thanks for that, Erin. I never knew in the history that that's where like disability education came from. And thanks for bringing up the parallel it has to our not so other great history of segregation for students in schools. So I never really thought of that. Thanks for bringing that up. So that goes kind of into my next question, which is about more of today. What does mainstreaming mean for students today with disabilities in classrooms? And how would that be different from special education today?
Yeah. Well, I wanted to I start, I think, by talking about that term mainstreaming, right? It's been put out there in education for a while now, and it's not my preferred term, and it's not what I would say we do, right? In a lot of school districts and schools across the country, when they do a process called mainstreaming, what they're doing is having a student go to a general education classroom, and they often say it's for the social benefit. So they're really not purporting to have any academic benefit of the child attend that class. And there's not really a big push for them to meaningfully include the child in that classroom community, right? To have authentic presence, to have meaningful materials and content for them to engage in when they're doing their mainstreaming. And they often also do not provide the additional adult support that might be needed to make that child's participation in the general education classroom successful. And so, what we find when we look at the research, when we look across the landscape of education and people who try mainstreaming and then say, well, that wasn't very successful. Like that didn't really work to include that child with a disability with their typically developing peers. I would say, yeah, because you didn't set it up for success, right? We have to have the right resources. We have to have the right materials. We have to think meaningfully about what's going to help this child be an authentic participant in the classroom routine, to get something meaningful out of the experience, cognitively, socially, academically, and not just, oh, it's nice that they're here, right? So, when we talk about inclusion, we're talking about meaningful membership, participation, and being an authentic presence in the classroom, not a visitor, not someone who's mainstreaming, but really someone who is fully included. Um, I will shape our language even one step further. And this is something that just came to me this year. Um, there is a technical assistance center at the University of Kansas who are working with schools on a concept that they call rightful presence. And it's like moving inclusion and that language of inclusion to the next level. Because when we talk about inclusion, and that word is so in my vocabulary, it's going to be hard for me to change it. But that implies a certain power and authority that I, as the typically developing person and the adult who runs the school, has the power to include you or not as the child with a disability. The concept of rightful presence says actually they have a right to be here, right? They've always had a right to be at their public school and be meaningfully engaged with their typically developing peers. Um, and so I think that's important for us to think about when we think about this continuum of mainstreaming, inclusion, rightful presence, is that, you know, it's not as though I don't know, that they aren't part of our world, right? Individuals with disabilities are part of our world. that's just part of human existence and the great pantheon of all the different abilities, strengths, and challenges that we all have. Having a disability is one of them. And we all, as our human right, have the right to be in community with one another. So, yeah, that was a lot, but I think it's important because sometimes when we think about segregating students in these other educational environments, we don't appreciate that this is actually a civil rights issue, not just about education.
Yeah, thanks for that. That really did kind of expand my viewpoint here because we're talking about really moving the needle from like where mainstreaming is like over here, but the newer models and what you want is like all the way over here to where just everyone gets included and it's no longer a special status or kind of marginalization of a group of people out of an education they're entitled to. So
Yeah,
thanks for
absolutely.
expanding upon that. I'm going to go now to another term, which I think I have a bit more familiarity with. How exactly do you feel about the term disability? Because I know a lot of people have been talking and have been trying to change kind of their language around that and how they identify with it. Do you feel like people need to be cautious about how they use the word disability?
Um, so language is an interesting thing, right? And it evolves over time. It's never just static. Um, and I think the way we use language, um, like it informs and shapes how we feel about language, right? So if you go way back to in history, you go like, to the mid to late 1800s, early 1900s, the word imbecile is actually a clinical term. It's used to describe like levels of intelligence for people. And it was used, like research papers, educational publications. We use the word imbecile. And then as a society, we know that becomes a pejorative term. It's a name that we start to call people, right? It becomes, colored with these connotations of negativity. And everybody's like, oh my goodness, we can't use that anymore, right? We have to come up with something else. And so we go through these cycles of creating language or shaping language. And then depending on how people use it, maybe a term falls out of fashion. Um, One of the interesting current debates right now is, you know, talking about students with special needs versus students with disabilities. So I would say in maybe the 70s, 80s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 1960s, 70s, 80s, we started to like fashion language around students with special needs. And I think there was a feeling like that was like softer, kinder, more descriptive, etc. And there's actually a movement within the disability community to be like, that's just fuzzy and vague, and it's not anything that we came up with, right? We as individuals in the disability community did not come up with this term. It was forced upon us. Like, let's call it what it is. It's a disability. Everybody has needs, and my needs may not actually be all that different from anybody else's. I just may need more of it for longer or whatever the case might be. There's nothing special about it. It's just a need, and like how much support I need is just dictated by what my disability is. So there's a movement around, owning that term disability again and just saying, hey, I'm a person with a disability, and this, that dictates what I might need in certain situations. Um, I think to your question, like, should we be cautious about it? The caution is to use the term respectfully and clearly and precisely, in a way that is respectful of individual people. If we start to use it as like a name calling thing again, well then yeah, like that creates problems, um, for any kind of term.
Yeah, it was really interesting to delve into language. And I feel like with the word like disability, people are like saying like differently able. It really depends on the group, what language they want to use. But I still feel like, yeah, there is kind of a stigma just attached to the idea of not being like as able or not having something. Is there a way how to kind of rethink that to be a bit more inclusive?
Well, I think it's what I would say is, when we talk about language, we talk about both what we call person first language and uh, identity first language. And different people are going to prefer one or the other, maybe based on who they are, what their disability might be, or just their personal feelings about it. Person first language is always like a student with a disability, a child with autism, a girl with a learning disability, right? Whatever it might be, but it's always the person first. We're going to say that the most important thing about this individual is their personhood, right? And not the autistic boy or the learning disabled girl or the disabled man, right? That's putting a label on them as if that's the most important thing. Where person first language says, no, we honor the person first, and then we might modify or describe with the disability if it's even necessary, right? Like I always use the line, my friend Bill, who uses a wheelchair, told me his thoughts on the presidential election. Why did we need to mention Bill has a wheelchair? It has nothing to do with that comment. He's just your friend Bill, right? So sometimes even when we're thinking about person first language, we have to think, does it matter? Is it necessary to report that they have a disability? Now, it's also important to know that there are people who, prefer identity first language. I think this happens a lot in the deaf community, right? They often are not, and there's I don't profess to be an expert on the deaf community, so don't get me wrong. I'm not telling telling you what they think on behalf of the deaf community. I'm not a member of the deaf community, but there is a deaf community. They do identify as deaf rather than people with deafness, right? So they want to claim that identity first language. Um, the other thing I'd say about disability and the stigma about disability is that um, the truth is, if we're lucky, and this is a weird way to think about it, but if we're lucky, we'll probably all be disabled one day. Give it time, right? That's just the way humans are. When we get old, we have trouble walking. We may have trouble with our vision. We may have trouble with our hearing, and it may be in profound ways, right? Our bodies start to give up on us a little bit the older we get. So the truth is we're all actually temporarily abled, if that's how you think of yourself, right? We will all suffer this human condition called disability someday if we're lucky, right? To grow that old.
Yeah, that's a different way to think about it. I think I remember in college there was a reading kind of about that and like ableism and flipping that on its head that everyone is going to have different abilities throughout
Mm-hmm.
their lives.
Yep.
There's, yeah. And that goes into kind of the last big term here. What about the idea of disability justice? And can you kind of describe like what disability justice means and maybe some history? Because it seems like you know a lot of good history and how it kind of connects with the other terms we've been talking about.
Yeah. I mean, I think, there are probably others that are even more capable than I am of talking about disability justice and sort of the disability rights movement in America. But, I think it is important for us to understand as a whole society, right, that we have a long history of segregation and discrimination against people who are disabled. And we have actually set up our world in ways that, is disenfranchising to those with disabilities. And that I think is the heart of what disability justice is about, is bringing attention and recognition to the fact that, there are human beings, first and primarily, human beings who have disabilities, and because of dispositions, attitudes, the way in which we've designed, our public spaces, are are discriminated against, right? Because of that disability, which we know under law now is illegal. But I think it's also important to remember that the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, right? It's a really recent law. It was passed in the early 90s. It's even newer than the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And I'm here in Los Angeles now, but I actually grew up in Iowa, in a very small town in Iowa. And one of our senators, Tom Harkin, was one of the lead authors on the Americans with Disabilities Act law, kind of a personal hero of mine. Go Senator Harkin. And he grew up in Iowa on a farm, and his brother was deaf. And he was motivated by the struggles and challenges that he saw in his brother's world to champion the Americans with Disabilities Act. And so now that, is enshrined in federal law, and those with disabilities have advocacy pathways to, assert their rights, but it is still the truth that, like other disenfranchised groups, they have to fight to assert their rights to be present, to be here, to be in these public spaces, to have jobs, to, right? I mean, to just work in the wide variety of ways that we all may take for granted in our society. And so that's what I think about when I think about disability justice, is like making sure that um, those barriers, intentional or unintentional, are taken down so that individuals with disabilities can access, the world like the rest of us do.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for just your strong view on this and really great perspective on this topic of just like it being for like human rights as well. I kind of wanted to go into your own story of this next question, ask you how has working with young people with disabilities really informed your own views of disability justice?
Yeah, I mean, it's that's a great question. I mean, I'll just give you a little bit of background. I think, as I said, I grew up in a very rural part of the country, grew up in Iowa. My hometown had about 3,500 people in the whole town. And, we had more people in our hometown than the rest of the county combined. So it's a very remote, very rural part of the state. And it was a great way to grow up. I love being from there. I love, having been a part of my hometown community. Um, but I think, like anybody, you grow up and you know what you know, and then you kind of go out in the world and experience new things, and it helps you create new understanding and new perspectives. And you're kind of like, oh, that is interesting. Like my, my great aunt had a developmental disability and spent a great majority of her time in institutions and later in care centers, right? Why was that? What was it about society that brought that about for her life? You know, or I think about, when I was growing up, I had a friend who, we were friends when we were in elementary school. Me and my family, we moved away for a while, and we moved back, to that hometown area again years later. And this particular student, this particular kid had been identified with a disability and was in special education services in my school. And we never took a class together again. This is in a school of less than 300 people. I had a graduating class of 66 kids. And this other student, this other kid, that I'd been friends with years before, spent almost their entire high school career in one special education room in the school. And so then, as an adult working in education and in special education, you kind of think back and you go, why was that? What was going on there? What were the decisions that the adults in that school community were making or had made to sort of bring those conditions about? So I think that's what, my career, that I think really largely the thing that I was passionate about and why I became a teacher at all was I really loved history. I loved books, so I loved to teach those things, um, and writing. But I also loved thinking about how people learn and taking that apart, and why is it challenging for some people to learn some things and easy for them to learn others, and how does our brain and our mind actually work? And so that kind of, got me passionate about supporting kids who maybe struggled with learning to become effective learners. And then, that was sort of my first step on the journey to, like, you know, there are a lot of obstacles in their way. There are a lot of the ways that we design schools and school systems that aren't particularly awesome for those with disabilities. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's a really great kind of story, and that makes me think back to kind of just how like much stigma I think I personally faced, where it's like that closed off thing, and a lot of people just kind of are not necessarily seen as much as people, or how deeply ingrained this ableism and segregation is like within school systems. So going into that, kind of some people hear more about like this idea of like mainstream or inclusion, and say that since every student is different, schools are really underfunded, they don't have resources. If students are really, really different from each other, how is it even possible to accommodate every person with a different ability level in like a classroom?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. And I'll tell you the things we use here and how we try to do it. And we're not perfect. We make mistakes all the time, just like everybody else, but we really do kind of cling on to like five big ideas of how we run our school. And I think that more than who's here, it's sort of like how we're running our classrooms that make the difference, right? So we believe in universal design for learning. That means that every lesson that we have, we're always thinking about multiple means of representation, multiple means of engagement, multiple means of expression, right? So there's not just one thing that you're going to hear, and then you have to, kind of do the one thing that the teacher tells you, and everybody's going to have the same exact product at the end of that lesson. It's like, no, there's lots of pathways, lots of opportunities. Our classrooms are very dynamic. Learning has lots of options and opportunities in it. Um, we believe in co-teaching, where general education teachers and special education teachers run the classroom together. So in our classrooms, every classroom is going to have a general education teacher, 1 to 2 classroom aides, depending on the needs of the students who are there, and a special education co-teacher who's co-teaching in about 3 different classrooms on a set schedule throughout the day and throughout the week, right? So instead of designing our school like most schools and school districts do across the country, where they actually run parallel programs, right? They might, the sign out front might say Sunshine Elementary, but inside they have a program for typically developing students. They have a different program with different staff for students with special needs. Often another program with different staff and other kids for kids who are gifted. And then maybe, depending on the part of the country where this school exists, another program or classroom or set of classrooms with different staff for students who are English learners. And so they run all these programs, and by doing that, they separate their most valuable resource, the talented and highly educated adults who come to work there. So we do the opposite. We put those talented and highly educated adults together in teams to work together, right? To teach and meet the needs of all the kids in a dynamic, flexible classroom. We also believe in positive behavior intervention and support, much more focused on praise than consequences, and really praising what's going well for kids. Uh, effective use of those additional adults in the classroom. We have a lot of training that goes into those classroom aides and how they can be most effective to help all the kids. And then the last piece is what we call a constructivist approach to teaching and learning, which is kind of fancy education speak, but what it means is like kids have to build their own understanding. They have to construct their own understanding of the idea. You can't just stand up there and tell a kid something and have them know it like you know it. That's right. That's not how humans learn. So I often say if you come to our school to visit, our classrooms are not 5 straight rows of desks pointed at one smart person. I usually let people know that we are suspicious of desks in rows. We think they might get in the way of authentic learning. And so when you come in, even the physical design of our classroom is about putting kids together to work, to discuss, to work on projects, to be active learners in the classroom. So those are the 5 things. So really when you ask, like, how do you make this work? How do you bring all this diversity together? How do you meet the needs of all those kids? Is you create flexible classroom spaces that are well resourced with the staff together rather than split up throughout your school. And in that way, you don't have narrow pathways toward achievement and success and learning in a classroom. You have multiple pathways where you can bring all kinds of learners to success.
Yeah, thank you. You're really blowing my mind of all the different ways of thinking and approaches. It's really great to hear that you're kind of bringing the community together, that all these people who are there anyways can be there together and kind of collaborate. Because for my brief stint as like a camp counselor, I taught arts camps. I realized like I taught some stuff by myself and I also taught other people that even just having a code teacher, I guess, or someone to take the lead, like more people, I guess, teaching in the classroom, it's like harder to coordinate, but it's more effective, I guess. Sometimes a lot of summer programs require that like students are not left like alone. Like it's like a ratio of like 8 to at least 1 adult. I know most like all the schools I've been in, I was in Denver public schools and stuff like did not have that ratio. It was sometimes 1 adult to like 30 students or 25 students. So
Yeah.
yeah,
And I'll say, so you're right on. Like even in that art camp experience, you're like, okay, there might have been more in the details of like coordinating the 2 of us working together, but it was more fun to work together. And the kids got more out of that experience when we worked together. And I don't know where you're at in Denver public schools, but I can tell you that scenario you described pretty common all over the country, right? 1 teacher in front of 30 kids. What a lot of people fail to like really think through is there's another person down the hall with 5 kids or 4, and it's called your resource room, whatever the case might be. And you could be like, well, let's put those kids together, those 30 and those 4, and now we got 34 kids. You're like, oh, we got more kids. Yeah, but now you've got 2 teachers. And like, think of all the great possibilities we can do now, right?
so it's just a form of using your resources, bring them together. The other kind of follow-up question I had to that is you brought up gifted students and then like the special needs students. And I feel like in school, people very emphasize this idea of achievement and, like trying to reach goals. And there was kind of this limiting perspective, I think, on these categories where it's like some people, high your ability levels are going to succeed. And some people who may not have it there yet in them, are not going to be able to reach those benchmarks and may get in the way of maybe other people or the idea of like high achievement. How exactly kind of can you tell those people that they're wrong or that overall everyone's achievement can be boosted from being together?
Well, I think that's true. And I think what you can look at research and when, inclusive programs are operated with fidelity, with quality, right? And there are indicators around what those are, and those are in the research. And you talk about your staffing ratios as well as, the instructional approaches that you're going to use so that you actually effectively use those multiple adults in a classroom. But when that is put into place, research will tell you that students with disabilities achieve in a much greater fashion than they would if they were in segregated special day class or resource rooms. And even your most pessimistic research shows that typically developing kids, there's like no harm. They maybe learn exactly the same as they would if the kids, if that structure wasn't there. Um, and then there's a lot of research that shows that a lot of times they do learn more. That's kind of research. You do 20 studies and 10 will tell you one thing and 10 will tell you something, a version of that, and maybe two of them on either side are kind of outliers. But you get a lot of agreement, like there's that, like this is supportive of achievement for all kids. I mean, I think what I would say is that as schools, there are things that we need to ensure that we're teaching all kids and that they have mastery over, right? So I would never totally back away from rigorous, high quality education. Kids need to achieve, kids need to learn, right? Got to learn to read, got to learn to do math, got to learn to communicate in writing, speaking, right? You got to, even if you use supportive assistive technology tools to do those things, we got to get you to be a literate person in our society, because that's a human right. And that's what we should be giving you as a human who's going to leave this school someday and go out in the world, right? Now, as you identified, there's this push for like achieve, 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 more, 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 right? And is that where we should be driving our education? And is that really honoring of all kids? I think that the truth is probably not. Like we probably need to tap the brakes a little bit and be like, yes, we want rigorous academic standards. Yes, we want to make sure everybody's prepared for life, but we also need to recognize that there are all kinds of talents and skills that don't actually, show on, a standardized test. There are all kinds of ways in which someone can contribute and be a meaningful member of the school, of the classroom, of society. Um, I think the other thing is, when um, we create these situations where we kind of like box kids into programmatic destinations. Okay, you're going to go to the special education program. You're going to go to the gifted program. You're going to go to the English learner program, whatever. We're sort of, pretending like they are all the same and all need the same thing. And that's just not really true. Like that's not true of any group of humans that you put together. You're always going to have to differentiate. So like a little additional differentiation because you've got them all together isn't necessarily all that bad, and probably pretty productive. I think about, again, my personal experience. I go back to that little rural school in Iowa, right? So when I was going to school back in the 80s, there was this big push for gifted and talented programs, right? Everybody had a gate, or some states called them tag, talented and gifted. So, or let's find who our gifted kids are and let's make sure we serve them. And, this will sound like bragging. I'm not really trying to brag, but, I took the test like everybody else and they identified me for the talented and gifted program. Great, whatever. But the thing was, we were a rural high school with fewer than 300 people. There was no, like, we didn't have the staff or the money or the resources to be like, oh, okay, now you go to this gifted classroom or this gifted school or this, right? There was none of that. What we actually did was there was a teacher who, I think it was her like part of her job, not even her whole job, to be the talented and gifted coordinator. And we did projects, right? We got to do independent projects. So like for 1 or 2 study halls or whatever, during our week, we got to work on those projects. Now I think about that in 2 ways. One, thank goodness, because even though I got the score, whatever that magic score was, I was not talented and gifted in math. And if I had been sent off to like some other program where all of my classes were gate classes or whatever, like I probably would have drowned. Like I might have been fine in the history and the English language arts, but I was not going to knock it out of the park in math or, probably not even science. And then the other piece was, because I had choice and could come up with projects, By the time I hit my senior year in that program, I designed a project where 3 times a week I went down to the elementary school and taught creative writing with the elementary kids. And in each one of the classes we that I had and got to be a part of, we all wrote a book together, right? And so we created these writing experiences for the kids. And now, like, I think about that, and I probably didn't even realize it at the time, but all the things that one experience fed into who I became as an adult, who I became as, in my career, um, which you could never possibly capture, right? In sort of being in the GATE program, and all your classes are, supposed to be accelerated or advanced. But by leveraging, choice, autonomy, interest, right? And allowing me to be like, yep, I don't need you to get an A on every test, but let's think about who you are as a learner and as a creative and intellectual person. I got to create this whole other thing. So that's probably a long and winding story, but that's all to say. I think there's different ways at getting kids to achieve things and do things, and not all of them are about getting a 4 on your AP exam.
Hmm. Well spoken there, all those stories. Kind of going into this kind of different approach there into younger people. How can young people be better allies to their peers with disabilities in like schools and classrooms?
Yeah. I mean, so I look at this a couple different ways. And ultimately, yes, I think that some of the responsibility to be better allies is on the students, right? Um, and I think helping students understand that difference is not only like, sometimes we're like, say things like, it's okay to be different. Not only is it okay to be different, it's actually, that's being a human being. We're all different. We all have differences. We all have strengths and weaknesses. Some are more stark and may present us with greater challenges. But at the end of the day, we're all human beings that are far, far more alike than we are different. We have the same desires and needs, and we want friends, we want to be noticed, we want to be loved, like, you know, all the things that we all want. And that's not different just because someone has a disability. And I think the more we help people understand that, the more that they can open themselves up to being authentically in a relationship with someone. Because being an ally isn't just like, oh, I'm going to stick up for you because you're getting picked on, or I'm gonna be extra nice to you, right? Because you're an individual with a disability. It's really like, nope, I see you. I have empathy for you. I know you have something to add to my life. I have something to add to your life. We're actually in relationship with one another, right? And I see you as just a fellow person. Like, that's being an ally. And if we can help kids understand that, I think, they'll do it. I've seen them do it. The other side of the coin is the adults have a lot of responsibility here. We have to create systems and structures to help kids be allies to one another. And too often, that stigma that you were referencing earlier, right? Part of that stigma is inherited. The kids don't create that stigma. The fact that we as adults create environments in which we say, oh, those kids, they're over there. Those kids are over there, and you're here, right? And then we start to create group identities. Who am I with? Who's over there? Who are they with? Oh, I don't want to be with them. I don't want to be with them, right? And then we other people. I mean, kind of using other as a verb. We're going to other them. They're not us. They're something else. And that's where bullying comes from, teasing comes from, stigma comes from, because it's an act of dehumanizing other people. I don't have to be nice to you because you're not the same as me, right? I don't have to be your friend or your ally because you're not like me. And part of that division is actually created when we as adults create spaces, called schools, in which those divisions are reinforced rather than taken away.
Yeah, thanks for that. Because I actually heard a line from like my friend's book they were reading last night, where it's like just because having someone around, it's not an act of activism just to have someone around. It's a lot more than that. Like it goes a lot.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So going into the topic of young people, like I know a lot of it is kind of also for adults to be able to educate themselves. What resources do you recommend for young people to get more informed and involved in the topic of disability justice?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of resources out there. One really good resource that I would share for really anybody. It could be, individuals with a disability, it could be parents, it could be, siblings or friends, is a resource that I believe was developed by the National Center on Learning Disabilities. It's a website called understood.org, right? Understood.org. And it focuses on learning disabilities, which is just one kind of disability category under the law, and includes things like reading disabilities, dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, things like that, processing challenges. But it's kind of a good resource because learning disabilities are actually the most prevalent category of disabilities in special education. We estimate that 1 in 5 people have some kind of learning disability. So if you've got a class of, 20 kids, probably got about 4 to 5 of them are students with some kind of learning issue. And understood.org supplies a lot of information for people to read, to look at. They've got a teacher profile as well as a parent profile. Individual students or people can look on there and get information. It even has activities that you can kind of gamify what it's like to have a learning disability. To go on there, like try to complete tasks, but sort of messes with you, and you're like, wait, that didn't come out right, or that didn't happen right. It's like, yeah, for those students who have processing challenges, that are part of their learning disability, it feels like that sometimes, right? So understood.org is a good resource. I would say TASH, TASH, is a national organization for the advocacy of inclusion for individuals across the lifespan with developmental disabilities. So that's a great place to look. It is a organization that is made up both of individuals with developmental disabilities and advocates and allies. So TASH, again, it's an international organization. That's a great resource as well. And, I think, just being open to just different individuals and different experiences, and maybe the literature that is written. There are all kinds of really wonderful self-advocate blogs out there by individuals with disabilities writing about their lived experience. One of the, I don't know, phrases or little rhymes that have become common in marginalized groups is like, nothing about us without us, right? So if you want to know about disabilities, talk to someone with a disability, right? If you are thinking of like, how can we be more inclusive as a school? How could we be more inclusive as a student organization, right? Talk to someone with a disability, right? Read what they write, listen to what they talk about when they put their podcasts together. Yeah. So, I mean, I think those would be a few of my suggestions on good resources.
Yeah, I'll make sure to pull those up on the screen when I go over that section. And that was a really great. It's great to hear so many websites and that you thought up of a lot of great things, as well as just the importance of speaking to people and actually going to the source. Instead of like read a book about it, because I feel like that's been an issue before of communities trying to decide what's best for other people as well, without even having those people like in the room. So that's
For sure. Yeah.
Yeah, so to wrap it up with a closing question, because we're almost at the end of our time, since you've been talking about this a lot, how can we really apply this idea of like inclusion, mainstreaming, and disability justice to other contexts in like society and the world?
Um, yeah, I mean, I think that kind of to take from where we were just at in terms of, you know, making sure the voice of those with disabilities is centered, right, in this conversation, I think is really important. Um, I think, ensuring that when decisions are made, that those voices are included, that we're seeking input from individuals with disabilities as to like what their thoughts, opinions, and feedback might be, um, including, and if we're talking about younger children, including their parents, right? Because I think that's an important perspective. What is it to be a parent who's raising a child with a disability, and what are the needs that you have as a parent, and what's your voice in the decisions that are being made? And I think that, you know, whether it's obviously I work mostly in school, so that's where my head's at a lot of the time. But I think we could also think about other things in society, the bus, the train, the movie theater, the public spaces, on and on, the organizations that we belong to. Like, how do we consider what we're doing, how we're doing it, what we're designing from the perspective of an individual with a disability, and really focus a little bit less on, am I compliant? Did I check the box? Am I meeting the letter of the law rather than the spirit of the law? And more about like, how am I authentically incorporating the experiences and needs of a fellow human being who happens to have a disability? And have I listened to what they have to say about it? Right? I think we can get to that space. We're going to make much more meaningful and impactful decisions for everybody.
Yeah, thank you so much. Like my mind is so blown talking to you, Erin. You brought in such great points for thinking, and I'm sure that everyone else listening is also going to have their mind blown by some of this stuff. So yeah, thank you so much for being on here today to talk to me. Did you have any kind of final thoughts or words of wisdom before we close out today?
The only thing, I guess, first of all, thank you. I really appreciate you reaching out to me. I love the opportunity to get to share some of this information. As you can probably tell, my answers were probably too long-winded, but I think it's great that this podcast is taking an interest in this topic and wanting to share information to people about this. And ultimately, I feel at the end of the day hopeful, right? Because I think that um, as long as we are engaged and interested and asking the right questions, we're going to continue to move toward a more just, right, society for people, all marginalized people, not just individuals with disabilities. I think when we become uncurious, when we don't reach out and want to understand the experiences of others, when we don't care about groups of people other than our own groups of people, that's when I get worried. And I'm like, oh, we're headed down the wrong path now. So as long as we can stay engaged and asking questions and interacting with one another and people different from ourselves, I think we're on the right track.